Hello, everyone. You're tuned into the first Partners in Research live event of the 2015-16 school year. Today's session is co-presented as a virtual speakerhead by Beakerhead, taking place in Calgary, Alberta this week. My name is Brent Peltola. I am the Executive Director of Partners in Research, and I'm your host for today. Our guest for this special session is Dr. Douglas Hamilton, former NASA flight surgeon and now associate professor at the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. As you will come to hear today, this description only scratches the surface when describing Dr. Hamilton. First of all, I'd like to thank Shaw for sponsoring this virtual speakerhead and also send out thanks to Cisco Systems Canada for hosting Dr. Hamilton at their office in Calgary. Before we get started, I'd also like to welcome today's viewers online watching the live stream. It's great to have you with us today. Remember that you can tweet your questions to us using the hashtag AskBeakerhead throughout this live event. If there's room in your tweet, include your name, school, or city so we can give you a shout out. I'm looking forward to getting to some questions in just a moment, but first I'll turn it over to Dr. Hamilton to tell us about his career in medicine, space, engineering, and humanitarian efforts. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to this virtual speakerhead on PIR live event. And over to you, Dr. Hamilton.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak to everyone. I'd like to thank the Virtual Research on Call folks for facilitating this. We've had a bit of a discussion with Brent about some of the topics to cover. I'm a born and bred Calgarian. I'm one of the few. I grew up here when the biggest building was the flour mill, and now Calgary is this huge city of over 1 million. I went to school in Calgary, and I went to engineering school at the University of Alberta in electrical engineering, and then later I went into control systems and plasma physics. I was designing really large lasers as a graduate student. They would put out 100,000 watts. And we were using it for welding and cutting certain materials. Americans are doing the same thing, but for more nefarious purposes. Eventually, these neurosurgeons walked into my lab and said, "Can you build us a little 100-watt laser for neurosurgery? Because the Americans have been doing some really neat stuff with that." And we said, "Yeah, sure, no problem." It took us 4 years to build that darn laser and get it into the operating room. And we did hundreds of surgeries, not just neurosurgery, but surgery in the ear, nose, and throat. We even removed some tattoos from some kids that put them on when they were in jail. Anyways, I left. I did my master's in electrical engineering, and I left to work in the oil industry. I designed an electrical generator that works in very hazardous environments. That you could have an environment full of propane gas, and the electrical generator would not ignite it. And we built a company around that. Eventually, the University of Calgary wanted to have someone to install all the mainframe computers in the medical school and the medical research area. So I thought that'd be kind of a neat job. And so I interviewed for it, and they hired me. And this is before personal computers. This is before iPhones. This is before PCs. This is like, I'm a dinosaur, I admit it. So anyways, I installed all these mainframes, and I started to work in the labs to automate all these labs, these physiology labs and that. And I got working in one lab where they were designing a sensor to measure pressure around the outside of a heart. And I got involved in that, designing that sensor. And next thing I know, I'm in a master's of physiology. So I take my master's of physiology, and they talked me into doing my PhD. So I did that, and I designed the sensors so that we could actually do it on humans as they were having cardiac surgery. And I published that. So working with my PhD, I thought, well, I'm in for a penny, in for a pound. I applied to medical school. It took me 3 attempts, 3 years to get in. I applied to every medical school in Canada. And that's back in the days where you didn't do it on the web. You had to fill all these pieces of paper out and everything, and it was a lot of work. Eventually, I got accepted at the University of Calgary, and I did a joint MD PhD program there. And during my first year of residency was when in 1992 they had astronaut selection in Canada, and I got down to the final 10 astronauts, but that hosehead Chris Hadfield beat me out. So anyways, it's okay. Chris and I are great friends, and I've supported tons of his missions down at NASA. I finished off my fellowship, and I went to International Space University. And you should maybe Google that. International Space University is unique in that it teaches engineering and space arts and space technology and space medicine and space propulsion and everything. All so everyone becomes well-rounded in the whole topics of space. So I went to International Space University in Japan. It's held in a different city of the world every year. It's been down in Chile. It's been into China. It's been everywhere. And I actually teach there. I've been teaching there for 16 years. After that, I finished my fellowship, and I applied. I answered an ad in the Journal of American Medical Association for someone to support space medicine in Star City, Russia, because America and Russia and Canada and ESA and Japan, the European Space Agency, and Japan were building the International Space Station. And they needed somebody to support medical operations on the Russian side. So I applied for that. I interviewed 5 times in Houston, and the silly fools hired me. So I moved my family down to Houston, and I supported space operations in Russia for a while, but was seconded back to Houston to design medical equipment for the space station and support shuttle and station missions. We went down on a 5-year plan. We were going to go back to Calgary, but in 2003, the Columbia disaster happened, and I was one of the flight surgeons for that mission, and I lost my crew, all 7 people, very close friends. I lost them. I was in mission control that day, and it was a terrible day. But, I think a good measure of a society is how they pick themselves up after being knocked down. So we decided to stay until the shuttle went back into flight. And that was STS-114. And I was just about to come back to Canada, and then the Katrina disaster happened, and that's where New Orleans was flooded, and all of New Orleans had to get out. Everyone in New Orleans had to escape, and 40,000 could not escape, and they had to be rescued. And they were put in buses and sent to Houston, and we had to take care of 40,000 people with 12 hours' notice. And so we built a giant shelter in the Astrodome. The Astrodome is the first covered stadium ever built in the world. And it took several weeks to take care of these folks. And these folks were very sick. As the buses came in, 10% of them couldn't even walk. They were so dehydrated and debilitated. We filled an ambulance to go to the Texas Medical Center every 4 minutes for 3 days. And eventually we took care of these folks. But that changed me. I suffered a post-traumatic stress disorder from that, from seeing all the terrible things I saw. But it was a success story because Houston took care of them. So we were just about to move back after Hubble, and then after Katrina, and then they gave me the Hubble repair mission. And the Hubble repair mission was unique because it's the only time we've had 2 shuttles on launch pads at the same time. When I watched that Bruce Willis movie Armageddon, and they had 2 shuttles on the launch pad at the same time, I thought that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. You need 2 launch rooms, you need 2 mission controls, you need 2 of everything. And yet that's exactly what we did for Hubble. Because if the Hubble repair mission had a problem with their thermal tiles, this other mission would launch and rescue them. And I was the flight surgeon to the STS-400, the other mission. So the mission that everyone prayed would never launch. And it didn't, and it was successful, and the Hubble is still alive and well. After that, we were going to go back to Canada, and then Hurricane Ike came and decimated our neighborhood and Seabrook. So we stayed to help for that, and then the Canadian Space Agency wanted me to become a flight surgeon for them down in Houston to support Bob Thirsk. Bob Thirsk is the first Canadian to fly on the space station. Chris Hadfield's the second, but Chris is the first Canadian commander of the space station. So I supported Bob's mission. I trained for 2 years with Bob. His mission was 6 months long. And after that, Bob came back, and he launched and landed in Kazakhstan because that's what they did. And then we decided, well, we might as well stay to the end of the space shuttle. So the space shuttle program ended in 2011. I was there in mission control when it landed. And then we moved back to Calgary. And so in Calgary, I'm practicing internal medicine. I specialize in complex chronic disease. I specialize in patients that have multi-system disease. They've got congestive heart failure, they've got kidney failure, they've got lung failure, they're diabetic, and I try and keep them out of the hospital. And I'm trying to use technology to do that. I'm trying to develop sensors that go in the home so I can monitor their health. I'm working with the Department of Electrical Engineering and Biomedical Engineering to work with these sensors with Alberta Health Services. And one other thing I'm doing research on is that when astronauts go to space, they have the pressure in their brain goes up. And they have sometimes this problem when they come back to Earth. It can last more than 6 months. It changes their vision, and it changes many things. And so we're trying to figure out why that happens. So I'm here now, up in Calgary, and I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up. I'll just leave it with that, Brent.
Thank you for that very interesting overview of your career. As Dr. Hamilton said, he and I had an opportunity to chat about a few of these pieces beforehand. It's an amazing career, and I look forward to getting into it a little bit more. I did say that we did have an early question before the session started, and it's one that I wanted to ask as well. And so this is from Tom Curry at Dramatic Science, tweeting under Dramatic Science, and he's added the ironic hashtag flight surgeon misnomer to his question. And the question is, what's the most common surgery done in space?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, let me clear up some stuff here. The flight surgeon is a physician that specializes in aerospace medicine. The term surgeon comes from the old days of the Navy, when basically all the surgeon ever did was cut things off. They didn't have medicine or anything. And so when it got into the military and the aviation community, they just called them flight surgeons, but they're really physicians who practice aerospace medicine or space medicine. Surgery that's been done in space. There's been no surgery done on humans in space, except for maybe the odd laceration. But there's been some surgery done on rats and other animals. But we have simulated surgery using a plane that simulates zero gravity. How does it do that? Well, if I were to take a little mouse and put it in a shoebox and throw the shoebox in the air, the minute the shoebox leaves my hands and goes into this big parabolic trajectory, the mouse is experiencing zero G, is experiencing weightlessness, and it will until I catch the shoebox. So let's take a bunch of humans and put them in a plane and throw it into the air, and we can do the same thing. We'll experience zero G for about 25 seconds, and then 2G for about 25 seconds. And you do that for about 60 times until everyone's finished throwing up. And so a lot of the procedures that we train the astronauts, we've already verified in this environment. So that we've done simulated surgery using microlaparoscopes, small little tubes that you put into the belly and do surgery there, putting chest tubes in, the lungs, doing all sorts of plastic surgery, so that if they had to do surgery in space, we've already developed the procedures, and we've actually trained the astronauts sometimes to do that. I don't know if, Brent, if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. Thank you. We have another question from Cobblestone Elementary School. And I'm going to paraphrase the question a little bit. Can you talk about the award that you won? I believe it was the NASA Exceptional Engineering Achievement Medal.
Oh, yeah. Back in the day when I built the lasers, I had to know a lot about plasma physics. And plasma physics is the behavior of matter at high temperatures. So it's so hot that a gas is no longer a gas. A gas is an electron and an ion. And so up in space, it's not a true vacuum. The space station is flying through this plasma. And as it does that, it collects electrons and builds up a negative charge. It's like when you walk around on woolen socks in your house on the linoleum and build up a static charge, and then you touch the cat on the ear and, or you touch a doorknob, right? It's the same thing. You build up charge. Well, what we found out that the charge could hurt an astronaut if they're doing a spacewalk. And we first noticed this charge building up to be bad was when Chris Hadfield was installing the robotic arm on the International Space Station back in, I think, around 2003. And that's what Canada built for the space station. We built this big robotic arm, and it couldn't have been built without Canada's technology. Canada should be very proud of the technology we built for the space station and the shuttle. Anyways, in order to figure out how the electricity could go through the astronaut, they came to me and they said, well, hey, Hammy, what's a safe current? What's a safe electrical current to conduct through an astronaut? And I said, that's easy, 0. And they didn't like that answer. And so I had to go and figure out how the electrical current would go through the spacesuit of an astronaut. And to do that, I used a supercomputer that did trillions of mathematical calculations per second. It was in North Carolina. And it took that supercomputer 2 weeks to figure out how the current goes through the astronauts. And so I published, I'm in the process of publishing that data, but that's how I was able to do that. So NASA recognized that this was new territory, this was new technology, and so they gave me this exceptional engineering award, which no one in space medicine has ever gotten before. Does that help?
Wow, that helps. That's incredible. It's inspiring to hear the work that you've done. We've got a few questions. I'll try and give a shout out to those people that are asking, and I'll paraphrase these questions. So from the Zumba twins, from Cobblestone Elementary, a couple other asking about that life as a flight surgeon. How did you get into it? And what was your day-to-day life like working as a flight surgeon?
That's a great question because, everybody kind of worries about what they're going to do when they grow up. And I still don't know what I'm going to do when I grow up. When I grew up in Canada, when I was young, the chances of a Canadian ever being an astronaut, we never dreamed we could be one. There was really no space program for Canada. And so I always thought that I would never be involved in the space program. I thought if I was, it would be as an engineer. And so maybe I could work in that area. But when I went through my medical degree and I started to just study aerospace medicine and space medicine, and then I had that chance to become an astronaut, and I got really close, but I didn't get in, and that's okay. You just go down a different fork of the road of your life. But I began to study space medicine, and I enjoyed it, especially at International Space University. And so when NASA asked for applicants to support space operations in Russia, space medical operations, I applied. And I think they liked the fact that I had a combined engineering, I had a medical doctorate, I had a PhD in physiology and a master's in electrical engineering. And so they hired me. But they said, Hammy, you don't have a good background in aerospace medicine. So then they sent me to United States Air Force. And I was sent to Brooks Air Force Base, and I trained with other American military doctors to become a flight surgeon. Took a little while, but it was fun. We got to fly in jets and centrifuges and all that stuff, everything that you need to know to support a crew who's flying jets or airplanes in the military. That gave me an adequate background because my background in physiology, I studied space physiology. So then NASA said, well, you've got the necessary background. We want you to be one of our flight surgeons. And so I joined the group of flight surgeons already there. And my first mission that I certified on was actually Julie Payette, a Canadian astronaut, flying in the late 1990s. And then I started to support more missions. So as a flight surgeon for shuttle, you would sit in mission control. You go down to the Cape, you take care of your crew and crew quarters. You make sure that they're stable and ready to go. You get them all suited up. You take them out to the pad. You then go to the firing room where they launch, the control room in Florida where they launch. Or, in my case, I got to sit on the fire trucks really close to the rocket. It's the best view of a launch you'll ever get. The whole fire truck just shakes. It's so neat. And then we fly to Houston and we work in mission control, supporting the mission. We do private medical. In a shuttle mission and a space station mission, the only people that speak to the astronauts is the capsule communicator. You see Capcom, you see there's only one person, except the physicians do too. But we do it in a back room so that no one can hear, because a physician has to have a private conversation with their patient. So we speak to the astronauts all the time, but no one knows about it. And so we do that throughout the mission, and then we have to go and back to the Cape where they're going to land. But they may not land at the Cape. They may land at White Sands, or they may land at Edwards Air Force Base because the weather may change. So we have to have flight surgeons all across the United States for the shuttle. In the case of but that's only for 14 days. In the case of space station, you're supporting your crew for 6 months. And you're working with Russians and Europeans and Japanese and, God forbid, Canadians, and we work together. We have tons of teleconferences to discuss how all the crews are working and together. So typically I would work 12 hours in mission control. I'm on 24-hour call for anything that happens. And they used to launch from the space shuttle, or in Bob Thurst's case, they launched from Kazakhstan. And we would launch from Baikonur, which was a top secret launch facility, which is no longer top secret, of course. And they would go to the space. We would rapidly fly back to Houston, support them for 6 months, and then fly back to Kazakhstan because they were going to land somewhere in Kazakhstan. And we would have to pull them out of the capsule after getting there with helicopters and bring them back. And of course, they're a bit disabled, and we can talk about that down the road because of being in space. And so the life as a flight surgeon during a mission is very exciting and very busy, and some incredible problems come up that you have to solve. One time, the machine that takes all of the sweat and urine and wastewater and turns it into drinking water broke. And Bob Thirsk had to figure out how to fix it, because if he didn't, Bob and 3 other crew members would have had to come home because they needed that machine to work in order for the crew to have adequate amount of fluid. So up in space right now, they're recycling their sweat, their wastewater, and their urine and turning it into drinking water. So maybe that gives you a bit of a flavor of some of the things you have to do as a flight surgeon.
That's very cool. Thank you. Want to give a shout out to Navi at Mountain View Academy, who's tweeting on behalf of her grade 7 class. So just to build on your last comment about recycling water, that class was wondering about elimination in space and what do you do with it? So you've answered part of that question, but obviously there's more to it than that. Well,
you're right. I mean, if you're going to put somebody in a small confined space, they've got to stay alive. So let's start with it. You have to breathe in oxygen. You have to take in liquids and eat food. Right now, most of the food we fly up. Maybe I could tell you a funny story about some sushi someday. But the water we used to bring up, all the water, and the oxygen we bring up. So now the urine the toilet would remove it. Basically, the toilet, you sit on the toilet and it uses basically air to draw the liquid into the toilet, and same with your poop. Get that in there too. And then we take it and store it. In the space shuttle, the toilet was really neat. In the space shuttle, depending on your anatomy, they had this little tube that would take your urine, and then the poop would go down and it would hit this fan, and this fan would spray the poop against the walls, and the wall had this container, this sort of plastic container, and then they would expose the poop to the vacuum of space and freeze dry the poop. So basically, that's the only place on Earth where the poop is designed to hit the fan. Anyways, so now that's called an open system, where you bring everything up, you consume it, and then you get rid of it, right? So now we want to create what's called a closed system. We want to start to recycle the fluids. So on the space, you've got water for injection, in case you have to do intravenous. You have water for consumption. Then you've got what's called technical water, which is water that is safe enough to wash with. And then you've got wastewater. And you can't get them all mixed up. But we are now turning our technical water and our wastewater into water that you can consume using the urine recycling system. So now the amount of water we need to fly up into space has been reduced by more than 60%, and we hope to get better. As we breathe oxygen in, we give off carbon dioxide. In the space shuttle, we use a thing called lithium hydroxide to absorb the carbon dioxide. And that's the technology that's been used for the moon landings, for Gemini and Apollo and Gemini and Mercury, and the Russians use it too. And we still use it on the Russian Soyuz. But now we've got technology that's actually taking the CO2 and absorbing it into a bed and then pushing it outside the vehicle. So we're not using just a chemical. We're actually using electricity to remove the CO2. But maybe in the future we can use what's called a Sabatier process, where we can actually take the CO2 and generate oxygen back, carbon dioxide, turn it into oxygen and methane, and get rid of the methane gas. Or complex the methane into a longer molecule and use it as a fertilizer for plants. And use the fecal matter as also fertilizer. So everybody's looking at trying to close these systems in. I worked for a project at NASA where they had 3 people living in a chamber, and in another chamber they were growing wheat. And these people were in synergy with the wheat. They would breathe oxygen and produce carbon dioxide, and the wheat would bring in the carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. And they would stayed in a neutral balance for 6 months. And so these are the kind of technologies that we're looking at, because if we go to Mars, we can't just fly all this stuff. It's too much mass to fly, too much water, too much food to fly for 3 years. So we've got to learn how to close these systems. Does that answer the question, Brent?
Yeah, that's fabulous. Thank you. Another question that comes from Bernie Four and Carter Walker is about what do you do, and I'm sure, I don't believe it's ever happened, but is there a plan for how you would manage a death in space?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes. But because it's a very sensitive topic, and you have to understand that this is an international community. So we have all these Europeans that are flying in space, and the Russians and Canada and the Japanese, and there's so many other people. I mean, we've had Koreans, we've had people from Spain, we've had so many other people. And they come from such diverse cultures. And all these cultures treat life and death and dying differently. So you have to be open and flexible and sensitive. Also, you have to be aware that the whole world community is watching you. And so you have to handle it in a very delicate way. And so, yes, we have thought about that. And I can tell you safely that we do have procedures and plans in place, but they're definitely not going to be made public because we think we need to respect the families of the crew member that may have passed away and the country of that crew member. So if that were to happen, we'd be on teleconferences and all that to make sure everything was done with respect and dignity. Now, with that being said, when Columbia happened and it broke up, the shuttle blew up and broke up at 150,000 feet in the air, going at Mach 25. And believe it or not, we recovered the crew remains. And we had a plan. And we worked with the Air Force Institute of Pathology to recover those remains in a dignified manner and take them for forensic analysis. And then, after all that was done, some of them went to Arlington in Washington and were buried in Arlington. As a flight surgeon, that's a part of my duty that I don't like, but I went out of respect to the families. I went to Arlington 3 times. It was amazing how that went down. And then some of the other crew members were buried in their hometown, like Rick Husband. And you would go and attend those ceremonies. And so we understand that space is a very difficult business and that it's high risk and that people are probably going to die because we're still learning. And maybe I'll just stop there and see. Do you think that answers the question, Brent?
I think that answers the question. Thank you, Douglas. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We have a question from Patrick Fogarty School in Aurelia. What achievement of yours was the hardest to achieve?
Yikes. I think the toughest one was Katrina. I got involved in the disaster management through NASA and other folks of Houston. And we were trying to figure out what would happen if the bird flu, the nasty flu that killed millions of people in 1918, came back because we're worried about it. So we came up with a disaster plan for that. But we had no plan for Katrina. We didn't expect that hurricane to destroy New Orleans. We didn't expect 250,000 people to occupy the 10,000 hotel rooms of Houston before New Orleans happened. And we didn't expect 40,000 people to show up at a moment's notice. What do you do with 40,000 people? So we had to make decisions instantly, real time, on how to take care of them inside the Astrodome. And these are people who had watched people drown. They couldn't find their loved ones. They were traumatized. They all were sick. And we had to care for them. And it was very touching and difficult. And every day we were making hundreds of decisions, not through some organized managerial fiat, not through some pre-designed plan, but we were making real-time decisions. Like when the Norwalk virus came in and infected 10% of the people, and I was one of them. I was very sick. I went to the Red Cross and said, before these people get up, I want to get an army of Red Cross, and we're going to go across the whole Astrodome, all 4 levels, and wipe their hands with bactericidal wipes. And within 15 minutes, 2 pallets of wipes showed up and 100 Red Cross volunteers. Like, where the heck did these people come from? And we had an incredible infrastructure that was supporting me. But that was the most difficult thing I think I've ever done. And I still actually get nightmares from it. I'll have a nightmare about something. I saw hundreds and hundreds of things that had changed people's lives forever. So I think that was the most challenging thing because it was so large and huge. I'll leave it there, Brent.
Great, thank you. So from Olympic Heights School, kind of an add-on to that question, how have these great accomplishments of yours taught you to never give up?
In certain circumstances, you don't have a choice. In Katrina, you just had to do it. When Columbia happened, you had to figure out why that vehicle failed. You've got to recover the crew remains and take care of the family. In certain circumstances, you have no choice. And in other circumstances, I've got a file that I should have brought here, and it's got hundreds of letters. And these are letters of rejection or acceptance for the things I've done in my life. Getting into medical school, not becoming an astronaut. I've got all the letters of rejection from all over medical school that I applied to over 3 years. And I used to read them out to students such as yourself. And I would say, put up your hand when you think you know what's going on. And he'd say, Dear Dr. Hamilton, thank you for applying to McMaster University's medical school. And he goes on and on. And then the new paragraph was, unfortunately, and then everybody would put their hand up. And the bad news letters, the letters that said, thank you for applying, or thank you for this, but we don't want you, it's like 15-1. And so I've had a marvelous career, and I've done all these difficult things and all these interesting things, but it wasn't because I'm a really smart guy. It's because you just don't give up. So if you've applied for something and you've got rejected twice, don't come crying to me, right? You got to keep going. You got to keep doing it, right? And, when I didn't get into the astronaut program, I was really disappointed. First of all, there were 5,300 applicants, and I got down to the final 10. I didn't expect to get that far, but I did. So I thought, oh, gee whiz, maybe this will happen. So when I didn't get in, I was really disappointed. But that fork in the road sent me to International Space University, allowed me to apply to become a flight surgeon. They accepted me. I got all this marvelous training. I'm the only Canadian with American Air Force flight surgeon wings. And then I worked at NASA and in Houston, and those other events transpired. But had I been selected as an astronaut, my life would have been completely different. I probably wouldn't have been involved in the Columbia disaster recovery, and I wouldn't have been involved in Katrina, and I wouldn't have been involved in the Hubble repair mission, or Ike, or Bob's mission. So it's amazing how a devastating fork in the road can actually be probably the most positive outcome. And you're going to come across these forks in the road and just say, okay, I'm on this highway, let's go. And you're going to continue to apply for things. When I got back to Calgary, I'm applying to do research to figure out why pressure is high in the brain of astronauts, and research to deliver remote health care in Canada using technology. And I've applied 7 times, and I've been rejected 7 times. And guess what? I'm writing 2 more grants, right? And that's what you need to do.
Thanks a lot for those comments, Douglas. We're going to get to the last question. I'm going to combine 2. So we have a question from Kendall at Calgary School asking, what are the after effects of space travel? And along with that, MJ from David Thompson School in grade 9 asked, how much taller are you when you get back from space?
Oh, wow, those are great questions. Well, I'll tell you what. When you go to space, you're in 0G. So the blood in our bodies tend to hang around the legs because we're in a gravity environment, right? But in space, there's no gravity to keep the blood in your lower legs. And so it goes up, and it goes to your heart, and you get skinny legs. We call them chicken legs. But it makes your face puffy. So, and when your face is puffy, it changes your sense of smell and taste. And so the food we give them has to be more spicy than the food on Earth because their sense of taste has changed. And I've been in the simulators, and they have got a beef stroganoff to die for. But anyways, the other thing that happens is eventually their heart gets used to that, and they can exercise. But as we walk around on Earth, we are loading our skeleton with gravity, and when we pick things up against gravity. And so our bones are made strong. But in space, our bones are like, hey, I don't need this much calcium. I don't need this much bone. It's so easy to do stuff. Your body dissolves the bone. And that bone gets into your urine, that calcium from the bone and the phosphorus gets into the urine, and you pee it out. Back in the days of Apollo, within 3 hours of them going to space, the amount of calcium in their urine tripled. And so we started saying, oh my goodness, they're going to get osteoporosis, they're going to get bone loss and be like old people. And also, we're going to worry about them developing kidney stones because of all the calcium in their urine. And that's true. Their bone loss goes down. But now we are exercising. We've got these machines that are like weightlifting machines. So we keep their bone muscle and we make them jog. But of course, you have to put on a harness to pull them down onto the treadmill. Otherwise, they float away. Same thing with the bicycle. We got to strap them into the bicycle. And we exercise them 2 hours every day so they keep their muscle and their bone. The lungs, they do okay. But the other one is your balance organs. As we walk around here, we feel the gravity. And we got really two sensors. You've got these vestibular sensors in your ear, and they detect motion like this, okay? And then we've got other sensors that detect gravity. They're called otoliths. When you go to space, the otoliths don't work because there's no gravity. So now all you have is these vestibular. And what happens is, just like if you're in a car getting car sick, what your brain sees and what the sensors are telling you don't agree. And a lot of astronauts, when they get out of their seat in the shuttle or in the Soyuz, they play around. And next thing you know, their brain says, I don't like this, and they get sick. Sometimes we have to give them medicine so they don't get sick. This lasts maybe 3 days. Then their brain gets used to it. So now we bring them back to Earth. They lost all the fluid in their legs, which means that they've got a low amount of fluid in their body. It's normal for space, but it's low for Earth. So a lot of astronauts, if we don't get to them right away, and that has happened in the Soyuz, that happened shortly after the Columbia disaster, they couldn't stand up. They're literally crawling around on the ground because if they stood up, the blood would leave the heart and go to their legs, and they would pass out. So what we do to prevent that is we put special pants on their legs, like compression garments, to squeeze the legs to prevent the blood from going there. We will also make them drink a whole bunch of salty water so that the salty water stays in their blood system and doesn't go away. Excuse me. And for the balance organs, there's really not much to be done. And we just wait, and it takes them several days to maybe a week for their balance organs to get used to gravity again. We worried about that for the shuttle because the shuttle requires a pilot to land it. And we thought, what happens if the pilot gets dizzy? And so we found out in the case of shuttle, being 14 days in space, that wasn't so much of a problem. And people will be able to tolerate that. So we have a whole program to recondition our astronauts after they land. And we start the first day. When Bob came down the first day, we had physiotherapists and exercise physiologists working him with weights and balancing exercise and everything. And as a flight surgeon, I oversaw that. So space changes the way our physiology is in space. And so if we're going to have people living in space for a long period of time, like taking 90 days or 6 months or more to get to Mars, and then we have to figure out what about 1/3 gravity? Is 1/3 gravity like 0G, or is 1/3 gravity like Earth? Same like the moon. The moon is 1/6 gravity. How much exercise do I have to do on the moon versus 0G versus Earth? And these are all these questions because humans are going to go and live on the moon. I believe I will see it before I die. I'm kind of hoping to see us live on Mars. But that's where you take the physiology and turn it into, and use your knowledge of physiology and medicine and figure out what it's going to do to these physiological control systems that maintain humans alive on Earth. We now have to figure out how to do it in space. I don't know if that answers the question or not, Brand.
That was fabulous. Thank you, Douglas. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. I'd like to say thank you to all of our live stream viewers. Of course, thank you to Shaw for sponsoring this virtual speakerhead. Thank you to Cisco for hosting Dr. Hamilton today. And most of all, thank you to Dr. Hamilton for taking the time to answer our questions and share his experience with us today. Thank you so much, and a big shout out to the Beakerhead team. Thank you very much. The PIR live event season will be in full swing starting October 8th when we go back to space with Ryan Marciniak. Ryan is from the Ontario Science Centre and Astronomy in Action. If you can go to the Partners in Research homepage at www.pirweb.org for links to live event and other programs that we offer. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Dr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Brent. And kids, remember, never give up.
Thank you for that message. Take care, everybody.